Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Neeler, and on behalf of the Eisenhower Institute and Gettysburg College, a sincere welcome to all of you who've joined us today. We're really privileged to have with us one of the premier experts on international public opinion, Bruce Stokes. Bruce is a transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund, where he serves as the executive director of their task force on the future of transatlantic relations. Good issue to be dealing with today, Bruce, is we've got Ms. Merkel visiting here in Washington. Many of you may also know Bruce from a lot of interviews he's done over the years, and his many years as leader of the prestigious Pew Research Center's Survey of Global Economic Attitudes, and also his leadership at Pew on a host of public opinion projects that have touched on special issues around the world. Bruce is a former fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations and I believe twice a Japan Society fellow. He began his career as an award-winning journalist, specializing in trade and international economic issues. And it's where Bruce and I first met. He was at really what was the weekly magazine of record here in Washington, the nonpartisan National Journal, where he won the John Hancock Award for Excellence in Economic Reporting and was named by International Economy magazine and the Washingtonian as one of the city's most influential business writers. In fact, one of the most influential business and international economics writers in the country. He's the author and co-author of several books, including America Against the World, How We Are Different and Why We Are Disliked. More than all that, Bruce is a fellow Western Pennsylvania native and a friend and mentor for over 3 decades. And I'm most grateful that he would make time in a really busy schedule of international speaking to share a presentation today with us on how America is viewed around the world, and in turn, how Americans see the world. This is a perfect time to be taking a look at these issues as we begin the Biden presidency. We've said that we weren't going to take questions, but Bruce has graciously said he would be prepared to jump in. And if time allows at the end, my colleague, Kevin Lavery from Eisenhower Institute is going to curate questions at the end. If you can put those in the chat. And so without further ado, and thanks to Bruce, let me hand it over to you, Bruce Stokes.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank the Eisenhower Institute for this kind invitation. And I look forward to our discussion around these issues. The public opinion data is always something that's fascinated me, but what is even more interesting is to hear your reaction to it and to get your sense of what it may mean, or maybe what it doesn't mean in terms of America's place in the world, Americans' interest in engaging with the world, and so forth. So without further ado, why don't I start a presentation of some of the most recent public opinion we know about how Americans see their role in the world and how foreigners see America's role in the world. Let me share some of this screen shot with you if I can. And get this in a bigger version if we can. What I'd like to present to you is data that's been gleaned from 2 recent international surveys, one by the Pew Research Institute, where I used to work. Pew has been doing international public opinion research since the year 2000. And I helped design this survey initially at that point. And also survey from the German Marshall Fund, its annual Transatlantic Trends Survey, which I also ran for 2 years, to give you a sense, and some Gallup data, which is Gallup is one of the premier international pollsters. A couple of things about public opinion data that to preface this with. One is that you don't know what the respondents were thinking when you ask them the question. And George Gallup used to say years ago the most important thing about public opinion research is you ask people a question and they give you an answer, and don't try to overinterpret that answer. Because when you do that, you're projecting your views on their views. We have to take their views at face value. The second thing I think to remember about public opinion research that I had to learn was that people cannot necessarily explain to you why they had the view they did. Somebody calls you on the phone or comes to your door or works with you online and asks you a question, you're going to give an answer. That does not presuppose that they have a great deal of knowledge about the question. So one of the things that you as consumers of public opinion research should understand is that knowledge questions actually are the least trustworthy questions. What you want is emotional questions. I had to learn this as a pollster, moving from a journalist to a pollster. I always wanted to know exactly what people thought about a particular issue. They don't have the knowledge necessarily. And that's not a criticism of them. They have lives to lead. Those of us who follow these issues, we may have the knowledge, but most people, when you ask them a question, you get an emotional response, not a rational response, and that's okay. People vote on emotion. They go into the marketplace and buy products based on emotion. And we want to know how they feel about an issue, not necessarily what they know about an issue. And the final issue to remember about public opinion research is that human beings are infinitely capable of holding mutually contradictory emotions at the same time. So when you look at public opinion data, you will often see, well, how can they say this if they said that? These things are contradictory. Well, actually, they aren't contradictory in individuals, average person's views. They're just how they feel about something. And we should acknowledge to ourselves that we also hold mutually contradictory emotions all the time. We love our children and we're angry at them at the same time. It is the nature of being human, and public opinion research will surface these contradictory emotions. And the challenge of leadership and the challenge of politicians is to work with those contradictions, not to cherry pick one or the other, but try to work with those contradictions as we try to engage with the world. So with that as my preface, how is this U.S. seen abroad? First off, we should acknowledge that most Americans say it's important what other countries think of us. We care about what they think about us. We are not immune to having an opinion about what they think about us, and when we would like to be liked. What we have found in the most recent public opinion research, this is by Pew, but we found this in the German Marshall Fund survey and other surveys, there's been a dramatic improvement both in the views of the United States and in confidence in the United States president. And I can tell you from a decade of working with leading public opinion surveys, what is interesting is that the view of the US president leads the view of the United States. We might think that, well, this is ephemeral, it's the president of the United States, it's a popularity contest. Why is that so important? Well, it doesn't matter why, it is. When the view of the US president improves, the view of the US improves, not as much, but the view of the US president pulls up the view of the United States or pulls down the view of the United States. You graph this over time, you see it very dramatically. And so the view of the United States president actually is a more important indicator than the view of the United States necessarily. That said and done, in the most recent Pew survey, most people had a very positive view of the United States. I'm not quite sure what we did to the Kiwis in New Zealand to have a negative view of the United States, but they are the ones with the most negative view of the United States. And as you can see, these views of the US have improved dramatically in just the last year, gone up 34 points in France. They've gone up 33 points in Germany. So there's been a dramatic improvement in just 1 year of the view of the United States. This is, I think we can say very firmly, because the views of the US president have improved. As you can see, confidence in the US president and how he handles international affairs is very strong across the countries that were surveyed by the Pew Research Center. 3/4, the median of countries is 3/4 of the public have confidence in Joe Biden. This is probably my favorite graphic of all that I'll show you because it goes back to the year 2001. And you can see the views in 4 European countries of confidence in the US president. It declined under Bush throughout his tenure, shot up dramatically under Obama, declined somewhat under Obama, literally fell off the table under Trump, and now has rebounded sharply under Biden. We can debate in the Q&A session whether this improvement under Biden is because he's not Trump or because there's something about Biden that people like. But what is striking is this pattern. In these 4 European countries, but you can see it to a lesser extent in other countries around the world. What is, just to share an anecdote with you, I shared this graphic at the beginning of the Trump administration with the leader of the North American affairs in the German chancellery. And he looked at it and he had an insight that I hadn't had. He said, "Oh, isn't this interesting? It took Bush 4 years to get to this low point. It took Trump 2 months." But it is, what's interesting is that Biden has recovered almost all of this compared to Trump, back to the Obama levels of support in many countries. What will be interesting to see what happens to Biden's support in foreign countries over time. I can tell you that the Obama support was based on unrealistic assumptions. When we surveyed in 2009 about Obama at Pew, what we found was that Europeans said, this new American president who we love is going to bring peace to the Middle East. He's going to end the financial crisis. He's going to end the climate change. Highly unrealistic expectations. And I think it probably contributed to the fact that over time, his support declined a bit, still remained very strong at the very end, but we'll see what happens with Joe Biden's support. Biden gets higher ratings than Trump on a range of issues. When you think about, okay, why is it that Europeans and people around the world like Joe Biden? They think he's better qualified than Trump. This will drive Trump nuts. They think he's a stronger leader. You know, Trump certainly believed he was a strong leader. And they see him as far less dangerous and far less arrogant. They also, around the world, support a number of initiatives that the Biden presidency has endorsed. They support the U.S. rejoining the World Health Organization. They support rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. They support allowing more refugees into the U.S. So on policy issues and personality issues, this helps explain why Biden is seen so favorably around the world. But what does this mean for U.S. international interests? This is from the German Marshall Fund's survey, and you can see that Europeans support closer economic ties across the Atlantic very strongly. 7 in 10 Europeans support that, as do 7 in 10 Americans. So the favorability of the U.S. and of the U.S. president has policy implications. And also you can see there's strong support in Europe for NATO, especially in places like Poland and the UK. And while the French are historically questioning of NATO, even a majority of Frenchmen support NATO. So this is, from a policy point of view, this support for the US and the US president translates into support for closer economic relations and closer security relations. What about the impact of the Trump era and the January 6th insurrection on US soft power, especially the view of American democracy as a role model for the world? Remember, Ronald Reagan used to talk about the US as that shining city on the hill that everybody aspired to. Well, what we find is that, this is again in a Pew survey, that the US as a role model for democracy is no longer supported around the world. That basically people do not believe that the US is a good example for other countries to follow. They believe it used to be a good example, but it's no longer a good example. We have suffered greatly. The views of our democracy and our soft power have suffered greatly in the eyes of people around the world. Probably not just beginning with the Trump administration. This question was really never asked in this way before this year. Certainly, I think a lot of damage can be attributed to the Trump administration, but we should bear in mind that on other indicators, even beginning in the Obama administration, there was a belief that the US, for example, no longer is a guardian of its own people's human rights. In other words, in the wake of the national security agencies spying on other foreign leaders, you began to see a decline in beliefs around the world that the US protected its own human rights. And then with the Ferguson incident, where a Black teenager was killed by the police, further attention to other police killings of Blacks, then with the election of Donald Trump, that particular indicator also went downhill. So there's been a lot of damage done to our soft power image. And I think what is particularly worrisome in this one question about the US as an example of a good example for other countries to follow, it is among young people around the world who say that the US democracy has never been a good example for other countries to follow. So it's not just that they think in recent times that we have done damage to our example of our democracy. But as you can see, 4 in 10 young people in New Zealand, 4 in 10 young people in Sweden, 4 in 10 in the Netherlands, young people say we've never been a good example for other countries to follow. That's going to be harder for any president and to recoup that image among the next generation of voters and people around the world. The US partisanship has complicated our dealings with the rest of the world and views on American foreign policy. I don't think we can ignore that anymore. As you can see, Gallup asks a question every year about US satisfaction with its position in the world today. The first thing I think we have to acknowledge is that when my party is in power, I feel good about the US position in the world. When the other party is in power, I feel bad about the US position in the world. We have to acknowledge that what we're picking up in this question is not about the US position in the world. It's purely about partisanship. And that colors Americans' views of our engagement with the rest of the world. When Pew asked people what they thought would be or should be the major foreign policy issues in terms of the top priorities, note that the top priority was protecting the jobs of American workers. Now, arguably, this is not a foreign policy goal. This is an economic goal, but it's about how we relate to the rest of the world. So it's not surprising that when foreigners see this public opinion data, they think that America is headed down a protectionist path. I think it's a little more complicated than that, but I can tell you, if you break down all of this data on foreign policy priorities by income group, the income group that is most likely to say that protecting the jobs of American workers is the most important foreign policy priority is the middle class. And remember, the Biden administration has said that they want to create a foreign policy for the middle class. So trade policy that protects American jobs is likely to be a highly important goal of this administration, at least from a political point of view. Probably more interesting, it seems to me, is that the partisan nature of this of our foreign policy goals. As you can see, on almost every issue, there is a partisan split. While a majority of Americans say protecting the jobs of American workers is their most important foreign policy goal, it's 85% of Republicans who say that, and only 67% of Democrats. On maintaining the U.S. military advantage over all other countries, it's 68% of Republicans, 30% of Democrats. Whereas dealing with global climate change, it's 70% of Democrats who say that's a high priority foreign policy goal. Only 14% of Republicans say that. So again, partisanship deeply divides the country on foreign policy goals. And when you ask about confidence in Joe Biden to do the right thing regarding world affairs, 60% of Americans say they have confidence in him, but it is totally partisan. It's 88% of Democrats and only 27% of Republicans who say that. And again, when you look at individual foreign policy challenges that we face, improving relations with our allies, dealing effectively with terrorism, dealing with climate change, Americans are strongly believe that Joe Biden will do a good job doing this. But what is interesting, again, is, and actually I find very disturbing, how partisan that is, that 89% of Democrats say he'll make just good decisions about international trade. Only 24% of Republicans say that. Only 19% of Republicans say he'll be effective in dealing with China, whereas 83% of Democrats say that. So again, frankly, are we picking up here American opinions about foreign policy and about their president and how we will deal with foreign policy challenges? Or are we really just picking up that if you're a Republican, there's nothing Joe Biden can do that you have faith in? And if you're a Democrat, no matter what he does, you have faith in him. Again, the deep tribalism of our politics today infects views of foreign policy as well. And frankly, just to give you a sense of how Americans view foreign policy issues in general, again, it's very partisan. Support for NATO is strong among Democrats and has been going back as long as this question's been asked. And basically only half or slightly less than half of Republicans support NATO, and that hasn't changed. If you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, 58% of Americans have greater sympathy for Israel than for the Palestinians. But what is interesting, I would say, is to look at this. 12% of Americans had sympathy for Palestinians. In 2013, it's now 25%. So it's basically doubled since 2013. There is a rising support for the Palestinians among the American public. And what you see, I think, is that this is principally among young people. The green line shows the difference in support for Israel versus Palestine among young people. 43% of young people in 2013 supported Israel more than they supported Palestine, the Palestinians. So there was a 43 percentage point gap in that support. It's now 13%. Young people still support Israel, but far fewer do than they did, and far more support Palestine. This is an issue I think to watch, separate from the partisanship. Views of Russia have never been worse. If this goes back to 1980, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and look at the negative views, the black line is the total unfavorable view of Russia. It has never been worse in modern times. Similarly, views of China have never been worse in modern times, both among Democrats and Republicans. Yes, there's a partisan break. Republicans are far more anti-Chinese than Democrats, but 68% of Democrats have a negative view of China. And even when you look at specific issues around China, it is the Republicans who want to be tougher on China, who see China as an enemy, who support limiting Chinese students studying in the US. There's a very harsh attitude. The one thing where Republicans and Democrats agree on China policy is roughly equal support for human rights as a serious problem in China. And finally, because this question comes up all the time, is this just this partisanship on foreign policy? Is it just a result of the media bubbles that people live in? We now have some data on this, and people's intuition about what's causing this is right. For example, if your major source of news is on right-leaning audience, is from right-leaning media sources like Fox News or Hannity and Rush Limbaugh, 89% of those people support reducing illegal immigration. If your major source of news is from left-leaning things like the New York Times or the Washington Post or NPR, MSNBC, then it's only 3%. If you are concerned about limiting the power of Iran, 74% of people who get their news from right-leaning news organizations want to limit the power of Iran. If you get your news from left-leaning news sources, only 26% believe we need to limit the power of Iran. Similarly with China. So it is where we get our information does influence our foreign policy views. And you see this particularly with China. Whereas if you get your news from Fox and Rush Limbaugh, 75% of those people see China as an enemy. If you get your news from NPR and the New York Times or MSNBC, then only 18% of those see China as an enemy. So again, where we get our news does influence our views on these issues. With that, I'd like to end this presentation, but I'm really looking forward to your questions, your comments. So I'm going to turn this back over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stokes, for sharing that presentation with us. My name is Kevin Lavery. I work at the Eisenhower Institute, and I will be moderating the Q&A today. So we're going to start things off with a question that's pretty broad, but applies to the ways in which we're talking about the partisanship divide and the transition over time between the view of the U.S. in the world relative to the presidency. And this question involves whether or not the president historically and now gets a short honeymoon period from Congress, the American people, other countries, and where there's a presumption of competence and goodwill. Our hyper-partisan politics, as you've pointed out, have sort of erased that presumption. So can you talk about how that works in terms of the global attitudes, what you're expecting to see and what you're looking for in terms of data as from those other countries?
Well, certainly the international data suggests that there's a dramatic shift between one president and another, at least when we saw the shift from Bush to Obama and then from Trump to Biden. and the sustained high level of support for Obama suggests that that has some legs to it, that it lasts for a while. You don't know why people say they liked Obama more than Bush, or they liked Biden more than Trump. At Pew, we tried to ask people both their views of the personalities of these two presidents and also the views of their policies. Clearly, there were personality differences that people were aware of and voiced their perceptions of. But there was also, I think, some unrealistic sense of these two presidents internationally. Clearly, people, I think, liked Obama in part because he wasn't Bush, and they liked Biden because he isn't Trump, and they disliked Trump because he wasn't Obama. And I think with Obama in particular, we have to appreciate that the election of Barack Obama, who was a young guy, very articulate, very charismatic, and also an African American, said to many people in other countries, this is the ideal of America that we've always thought or felt, that Americans can do these. We in Europe could never elect an African American as chancellor of Germany or the president of France, and America can do this. And so it fulfilled their most romantic views of the United States. And like I say, it helped that he was very articulate. He was young. It was a new generation. Possibly some memories of John F. Kennedy for older people as a result. Obviously, Joe Biden's not young. He's not as articulate. He's not an African American. So I think we have to attribute this more to he's not Trump. But I should underscore that the support for Obama along policy lines were completely unrealistic. People did think he was going to end global warming. He was going to end the financial crisis. He was going to bring peace to the Middle East. And I remember at the time in lectures in Europe saying, look, have you ever heard of the US Congress? I mean, this is not going to be easy. And these are difficult challenges. And frankly, when Obama was reelected, we at Pew asked people around the world, okay, has he fulfilled any of these? And people acknowledged, no, he hasn't. We're disappointed. He hasn't done any of this stuff. It didn't substantially affect their view of him. It affected a little bit. And frankly, I can't explain the rebound in support in certain countries in his last year. It was almost nostalgia. He's about to leave, and boy, we got to remember all the things we liked about the guy. We'll see what happens with Joe Biden, and whether this support can be sustained. I think there is some unrealistic assumptions about Joe Biden. That's my personal view. We can't prove this in the data, but that while he speaks a good game about working with allies and addressing some of these challenges that Trump ignored or actually attacked, his ability to deliver on some of these things and his willingness to accept some of the limitations our allies face and their own domestic restraints will, I think, disappoint people around the world. And so whether he can sustain this level of support, and remember, it's not quite as high as it was under Obama. So he's starting at a slightly lower level. It will be determined by events that many of which are beyond his control, basically, because we don't know what's going to happen in the U.S. Congress, even before the election, but certainly after the next election, and his ability to deliver may be severely limited.
Thank you. We have two questions related to the relationship between the news cycle and public opinion. The first of these is how polling organizations try and correct for the news cycle and try and anticipate it? Are the topics and questions chosen based on what's being talked about in the news, or is there any effort put into trying to preempt the news cycle to sort of see what people are thinking and feeling before others start weighing in?
No, it's a great question. Look, first off, unless you're doing academic public opinion research, which academics do, where they ask, broad questions that really are disassociated from whatever the public's talking about at the moment. One of the reasons you do public opinion research is to try to get a sense of people's views of the issues of the day. And it is true that, you try to bring your own insight and say, well, it's not a big issue today, but by the time we release this, it may be a big issue. So we want to ask some anticipatory questions, but you can't get too far ahead of the public discussion, because if you do, then you've, as we used to always talk about when we were designing these surveys, you don't want to waste questions. You only can keep the people's attention when you're interviewing them for so long. And it's beginning to change a bit, just as a little backdrop. The best surveys in the past and still today are I firmly believe, are telephone surveys, at least in countries where you can do telephone surveys. You maybe can ask 40 questions in a telephone survey before people start dropping off and say, I don't have time for this, and they're going to hang up. So you want to be sure you ask questions that maximize the time you have with the respondent and are issues and topics that, even if they don't have knowledge about, they may have an emotion about. A perfect example of that would be when Obama was deciding what he would do about Syria and the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. And as you'll remember, he was going to bomb, and then he decided at the last minute not to bomb. But we, before that, asked people, do you want the US to intervene in this? And people overwhelmingly said, no, we don't want to do that. So actually, Obama's ultimate decision reflected really where the American public was. But what was interesting about that was we also asked people in that survey if they could find Syria on a map. And only 20% of the public could find Syria on a map. So this wasn't really a question about Syria. It was a question about, we don't want to get involved in another Middle Eastern war. We don't care where it is in the Middle East. But it was important to ask those questions about not only about what you want to do, but where is Syria? Because you wanted to get a sense of what people really were thinking and feeling. But it was a topical question. Some theoretical question about the future role of the United States in, the Middle East would have not gotten you at that issue. In terms of trying to filter out where the media is taking people, I think that's beyond the realm of pollsters. It's very difficult to do. One other issue, just because I raised the issue of telephone surveys, I think that people should understand is that increasingly public opinion is moving away from telephone surveys, just as it moved away from in-person. In the old days, people came to your door and knocked on the door. Then people moved to telephone surveys, survey firms moved to telephone surveys. Now, increasingly, surveys are being done online. And one of the things people should pay attention to when they see a public opinion survey being reported, if they don't tell you how they did the survey first, red flags should go up all over the place. Then if it's just an online survey, again, be very skeptical of the outcome, because it's whoever was online at that time, right? But increasingly, reputable public opinion firms, like Pew, for example, are creating panels of people. The Pew panel, I think, has 10,000 people on it now. And what you do is you recruit people. You ask them to join. If they don't have a computer, you give them a computer, because one of the things about computer surveys that people should remember is that it means that poor people and old people aren't included, because old people don't like computer technology and young people, maybe poor people, can't afford it. So you get disproportionately overly educated young people in kind of random computer surveys. But if you have a panel where you actually recruit people so you can have the correct demographic representation, and you train people how to use the computers if they don't have one, then you can get, you can actually ask them more questions, which is good. And you can do, because it's a very large panel, then average phone surveys have maybe 1,000 people. As I said, the Pew survey has maybe 10,000 people. The advantage there is you can slice and dice the data very nicely. You can decide, Orthodox Jews believe this, but evangelical Christians believe that, which is fascinating in our politics. But again, the methodology matters. And one of the reasons, by the way, that people are moving to these online panels is the response rate for telephone surveys is dropping dramatically. It is 9% in the United States now. So that means you have to make 11 phone calls to get one person to respond to your calls. And even if they fit all of your demographic characteristics, I need so many young people and so many old people and so many white people, so many Black people, you run the risk of you're only getting opinionated young people or opinionated old people, and you want it really a cross section of the public.
Great, thank you. One of the points that you made at the beginning of the conversation in terms of how people, the caution that you gave about the difference between emotional questions and factual-based questions. I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, and one of our audience members has a question related to that. How the difference between facts and narratives in shaping opinion arises, and what implications that has for people seeking to use this data, in particularly policymakers.
Right. Well, I mean, look, when I was a journalist, I remember vividly asking of public opinion people, tell me what the public thinks about Senate Bill 1101, right, or whatever, on a particular time. Yes or no? Should we vote on how should the Senate vote on this? And the reality is nobody's heard of that, right? If you ask the public that, you're asking people to voice an opinion about something they not only have never heard of, but they've never thought about. And the danger of pursuing too much fact-based public opinion research is that average people don't want to appear stupid. And if you ask them a question, they will, in many cases, give you an answer, even if they've never heard of what you're talking about and they've never thought about it. But again, they don't want to appear stupid. Now, good surveys give people the option of saying, I don't know. And certainly when you look at survey data, if you have huge, percentages of don't knows, it was a bad question. And I can tell you at Pew, we would occasionally do that. We'd have a question and we thought it was a great question, and you'd get back the results and you'd have a third of the respondents said, I don't know. And that was a sign we had failed in our job. We asked a question that was beyond the realm of public opinion research. So I think you have to remember, and I remember Andy Kohut, who was the founder of Pew and had been the head of Gallup for 10 years before that, used to stress that what we are trying to find is emotion. and not reason. And that is not to discount reason, and it is not to criticize the average person who maybe isn't aware of where Syria is. But it is a question that you have to approach public opinion research from where people are coming from, not for where you wish they would be or where you are, basically, because most of the people who are on this call basically probably are not, quote unquote, average Americans. They're taking the time to think about and worry about and try to learn more about foreign policy issues and public opinion, how the world views us. Most average Americans could care less. Now, we do know that if you, in broad generalizations, ask people, do you care about how that people, yes, yeah, we want to be loved, but they are not going to get into the details of that. And I think that while I still would love to know more about people's knowledge about the world, and I used to always joke that if you ask a knowledge question of the average public in any country, you're going to have your heart broken because the level of knowledge is so low. And that we, as people who probably think more about these issues than the average person, we have to acknowledge that we are in the minority, and that our views have to be tempered by the fact that average people are not going to understand this. That's not to criticize them. They have lives to lead. They're out there living on a day. They aren't reading the New York Times and the Washington Post every day. And but they will vote based on their emotions about these issues. They will go, more importantly, they go into the marketplace every day and they buy a red car rather than a blue car, even though it's the exact same car under the hood, because they like red. I mean, that's an emotional decision, and that's okay. In the marketplace, Henry Ford decided he couldn't sell. He used to only paint his cars black because it was a waste of money to have different colored cars, until GM started to sell more cars because they painted their cars different colors. And we say that's great. That's capitalism. That's the market and place at work, and we would celebrate that. We also have to understand that when we talk about politics and we talk about public opinion with relationship to public issues, that it's emotion what counts, and we have to understand that emotion more effectively and work with it, and avoid, as I said at one point, avoid cherry picking the emotions we like and discounting the emotions we don't like. A good leader, I would argue, and a good politician wrestles with the contradictions of those emotions and tries to synthesize a solution based on those contradictory emotions.
Thank you. And our last question is going to come from our host, Kevin Nealer, who's here to take over for just a moment.
Bruce, thank you so much, and Kevin, for your leadership on this. As rich and intriguing as your presentation was, I'll speak for I think a lot of people on the call. Equally valuable was the backstory you're offering on the methodology and some of the choices. That's a peek behind the curtain most of us just don't get. And it's so important to the quality of the product that when you were at Pew and working with these other polling organizations, you work so hard to achieve. Knowing a little of the thought that goes into that is fascinating, and it's a dividend we didn't expect today, or at least I didn't. Thank you so much for that. Look, one thing, I'm very mindful of your time and that of our participants, so I want to close out, but there's a construct in political science that you're aware of called the Overton window. This is simply put, and I'll misstate this, I'm sure, there's a range of possible politically acceptable choices on any issue, foreign and domestic policy, in which policy actors may make may come down anywhere on the continuum of the normal conventional choices. And I wonder, thinking about, and this is taking you beyond the data, and I want to utilize the conversations you have all the time with European, Japanese, other thought leaders around the rest of the planet. Putting the polling aside, you described the advantage that Biden has, this kind of honeymoon period we seem to be in. But as you talk to friends who are in leadership positions in Europe and elsewhere, do you have a sense yet of how much of a change in authentic expectations there are? How has the Overton window been expanded by the previous administration? I mean to say, when Japanese colleagues are sitting around talking about the things the Americans may or may not do in response to a kinetic action by the Chinese or an event on the Korean Peninsula, the Overton window that they had now looks different. And what would you say, what kind of adjustments and policy adjustments, how has the terrain been changed by the previous 4 years? And how does that affect the optionality of a Biden administration? If you were in government and you've worked so closely with people in both administrations of both parties, how do you think they're forced to recalibrate on what the possible reactions are of foreign policymakers when they test an idea or they suggest a policy option? Does that make sense to use that question?
Oh yeah, and look, Kevin, I think it's a very insightful question and observation, because I think clearly Trump's antipathy towards NATO, towards the Europeans, towards even our Asian allies, the spats he got in with the Japanese and even more so the Koreans, has raised questions about what the assumptions both Europeans and Asians had made about us and how dependable we were, what we would do in certain situations. It has forced them, I think, to think about what they would be willing to do or could do. And that's both positive and negative. And I think what strikes me is that, in a way, to a greater extreme, it's similar to what happened when Nixon became president. The new Nixon doctrine, and he began to push our allies to do more, because I think there was even I highly recommend to the listeners a new book by Jeff Garten, who is writing about the moving the U.S. off the gold standard and the dollar exchange rate with gold in 1971. But the broader backdrop is that Nixon came in and said, we can't sustain things as they are. We have to begin to change things, demand more of our allies. Trump, clearly, to even a greater extent, less sophisticated of the approach, has sent that same message to our allies. And I think, but the backdrop was a reflection of the fact that, whether we liked it or not, and this is still highly controversial, it does seem to me that the United States is no longer relatively as strong as it once was. And when you say the U.S. is no longer the world's leader, people say, "Oh, how can that be?" And you're wrong about it. It's not that we're still the world's leader, but we're relatively less strong compared to China, compared to others, than we were in the past. And that means the international order has to change, and the expectations of everybody has to change. And right now, especially in Europe, there is this, belief that Trump is gone and Biden is in, and multilateralism is back, and alliances are back. But there is this not just quiet, but actually voiced sense of, yeah, but can we trust the United States, and can we trust the American people yeah, going forward. Will they elect another Trump in 4 years? And it could be somebody who had Trump's views but was actually more coherent and more rational and more kind of structured in his approach to doing these things. And that's, I think, unfortunate from an American leadership point of view, but I think it's also realistic from their perception. And it does reflect the fact that the world is evolving and we have to adapt to it. Now, there's some value to that. I mean, witness statements by the Japanese Prime Minister and now the Japanese Defense Ministry's white paper, where they are actively talking about what we should do about Taiwan if China attacks Taiwan or pressures Taiwan in some way. The Japanese never wanted to talk about this. Between 1969 and today, they never mentioned it in any communique with the United States. Now they're actively talking about how dangerous this would be to Japan and what could Japan do, et cetera. Frankly, this probably wouldn't have happened without Trump. It obviously reflects also activities by the Xi administration in China, which they weren't doing or saying 4 years ago. But the combination of those two has led the Japanese to be more open about these issues. Similarly, South Korea has begun to talk about some of these issues in different ways. The South Koreans and the Japanese are going to host a joint meeting next week, which is surprising given the fact that they both face elections in the next year, which is, those relations have always been fraught. I think this is because they realize that the international environment is changing. In Europe, we'll see what happens after the German election, because that will be a time of some change. It's complicated by the fact that we've had Brexit and the UK has left Europe, and we don't really quite know what to do with that relationship yet. But I think there is a growing sense in Europe that militarily we have to do more. Now, I was just talking to a member of the Bundestag this morning who said, yeah, we have to do more, but the pandemic costs are such that we're not going to be able to do more militarily for a number of years. And I think we've got to acknowledge that. I'm sure we can increase our military spending the way we want to, necessarily because of the costs of the recession and the pandemic spending. But I think the interesting thing is going to be, as Joe Biden says, we need to rely more on alliances. We need to recommit ourselves to Europe and to our alliances in Asia. Is there going to be a U.S. acknowledgement that those alliance relationships have to change? It's not just going back to the good old days, but it's actually, what do we do adapting those commitments to multilateralism and to alliances going forward that acknowledges both the Trump era and the changing circumstances in the world that have to be addressed. And, frankly, if I knew what to do, I wouldn't be lecturing on this. I'd be in the government trying to do it. But the point is, I think that's the challenges that the government faces. And, we'll see whether the people are up to it. Because one of the things that we have to remember is that all of us, except for the youngest people on this call, all of us formed our worldview in a different time. And we make assumptions about the US role in the world and the world that may no longer hold because we formed our worldview at an earlier age. Napoleon once said, if you want to know someone's worldview, tell me what was going on when they were 20. And I think it's a lovely, insightful view that we are all prisoners of our past. And what we have to do is somehow adapt to the changing world circumstance and not assume that it's going to always be the way it was. And that's not easy.
I think that is a wonderful note for us to end on. Thank you, Bruce, on behalf of the Eisenhower Institute for your insightful analysis and commentary for us today. And thanks to Kevin Nealer for making today's event possible.
Thanks to all of you. Take care.
Thank you to everyone in the audience as well. We invite you to join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for any of our future events, and we hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.